On this week's episode of the Archive Podcast, we're talking everything that we're inspired by at the beginning of this calendar year. Now, the question you might be asking is what are we doing this year that's different than last year? Well, we're improving. So we've got some exciting announcements talking about not only gear upgrades that we've got, but also some special guests that we're excited to learn from, and we think you're going to be excited to learn from too. So without further ado, let's get into it. All right, well, welcome back, guys. It is episode 21, Austin, of the Archive Podcast.
Yeah.
So it's the new year. We're officially, as of recording this, 8 days in. 8 days in. I actually have on my calendar this thing where all year long it tells me at the header like what day of the year it is.
Sweet.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
It's been a few weeks since we've done a podcast.
Yep.
A much different look. If you're someone who is actively and consistently been watching the podcast, it feels much more, I don't know what the word is. It feels more professional, I think.
Oh,
this setup.
okay. Yeah.
Do you feel that way?
I feel like it's a constant state of figuring things out. Mm-hmm. But actually, in this episode, we're going to talk about some of the things that we are going to do this year with the podcast. Mm-hmm. A couple strategies, a couple gear things, all because I think we are taking it more seriously now.
Yeah.
Not necessarily because there's anything magical about January 1, but simply because this is just kind of the natural evolution of things. It feels new.
Boom, fresh start.
Feels new. New. Well, all right. This week, timely things, a little banter here before we get started. Snow.
Yeah.
Snow. Constant snow. Unpredicted snow. Right now, it is, well, still snowing over there. It's been snowing, and it wasn't supposed to keep snowing.
Yeah. I love it. I love the snow. If it's going to be cold, give me snow as well. I'd rather it be 25 degrees and snowing than 25 degrees and not snowing. I've loved it. I've also been running recently, and I love running in the snow. I did a 9-mile run a couple days ago.
Did you run actually in the snow?
It wasn't snowing. It had already snowed. And I did 4.5 miles out on a loop. So it was out and back, same loop, run there and then just run the loop back. Well, on the way there, it was great. But I was running into wind, so that was brutal. Then on the way back, the ground had frozen. The same ground, but it was just colder than when I started the run. So it was all a nice little thin layer of ice. And so I looked like a cartoon character. And I could literally feel like I couldn't get traction, but every once in a while I would. So like my foot would catch. And it was a fun run, but I've loved the snow the last few days. This
reminds me of the video that comes up every time of year that it begins snowing, and it's of the news reporter. She's out on the street after a good snow, I don't know, Chicago, DC. And there's this couple, and they're dressed out in this super nice running gear. And she's like, oh, you guys are out running? And the lady says, yeah, actually the snow means it's really good low impact on the body. It's just like, okay, well, you guys have a good run. And so they run off while she continues her reporting, and the camera pans to follow them. And dude, she doesn't get 10 steps away and just bites it.
Yeah. I mean,
that's what I thought of when you said running in the snow.
Yeah, and I'm training for a marathon right now, and I've always every time I get back really into running and training, I'm reminded runners are so delirious. You talk this big game, and then you're like, yeah, I got to get the miles in, and then the most stupid things happen when you're running, and you're like, I'm reminded that runners are just so delirious, and that we
listen. Everybody is though at a certain point, because you have to be, right. You have to be I think at this point, if you're past your teen years and kind of getting out of your 20s into your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, every person that I know that is active in adult life is a little delirious. Yeah. There's a little bit of maybe I shouldn't push it this hard, but you do anyways. I think it is the spark of hope within all of us that we are not as old as we think we are, and that we're more capable than we think we are.
Yeah.
And it's a careful balance to keep us from getting injured.
I agree.
So will you tell me a little bit about, because I know for me, I like making changes, with the new year before it's actually New Year.
Yeah.
There's enough hipster in me where I'm like, I don't want to do it at the same time as everybody else. But there's also a little bit of the other side of that is if I can get it done in November or December, or at least start it, then I go into January with oh, okay, I got a little confidence under my belt. How does that look for you? Because I think that might be what people are thinking about right now.
This was my first end of year to new year where I was completely caught up on things. Usually that's not the case. Usually I overflow whatever was not finished in the last year to the new year. This one looked a lot different, and I think I'm kind of realizing this about myself. When I'm thinking of like new goals for a new year, I'm really not trying to change too much, actually. I'm really just trying to now like build on what I've already built up the last few years. And so for me, that feels a little odd because I've always been used to like wanting to change something. And I'm really like, I don't want to change a whole lot. Like, I just want to do what I'm doing just better. And so that feels really good, like coming into this new year. Like, I don't have any radical things that I just want to like get rid of or add on to my life. Like, I want to kind of like pour into what I'm already doing. And that's why, like, I also want to talk about this podcast today. We experimented with it for 20 weeks, last year, which is, I mean, we pretty much experimented with it for half a year, this podcast. And I think going into the new year, like I really just said to myself, like, I love doing this. I don't want to change anything. Let's just build into it and like pour our energy and like, let's focus in a little bit more. Like, we like doing this. Let's not change a whole lot. Let's just see how it can be better.
Tell me more about it's not about radical change. It's about the incremental growth. Where did you get that mindset?
Well, the thing is like, I think people can find themselves in two different places going into a new year. In the previous years, I wanted radical change. And so like I went after radical change, and that was really important. But now I've figured out what I don't want and what I want in my life. And so now I know I'm happy. And so I just want to do things to the fullest potential. I think, I don't know. I think it comes from trial and error. Like the last few years, I've had those, things I've wrote down going into a new year. And I'm like, hey, I want to get rid of this stuff. I want to add this stuff. This year, I'm just like, nope. I don't want to do either of those two. I just want to do what I'm doing and do it better and like narrow down the things I'm good at. I think I've done that the last few years.
There's a lot of power, I think, in incremental growth. So it's kind of a known parable at this point, or not parable, but true story of the European bicycling team. I think they were from England. They were terrible for years. They got a new coach, and the coach was like, we're not going to do anything crazy.
Yeah.
Instead, you guys are going to learn how to properly wash your hands. Because if you properly wash your hands, you get less colds per year, which means you get more training days in per year. We're going to switch all of your pillows. So now your pillows help you sleep just a little bit better. And he made all of these really, really small incremental changes. And they beat their goal of like within so many years they were going to get a win. They beat that goal by years. And the whole point of that was helpful for me is big change is overwhelming to the human brain, or at least it is to my brain. So if I think about things, and I do this with clients all the time, hey, let's talk about like what's the 1% change we're going to make for this year. Because if you look at, and it might be better off in framing that in 1 degree for this analogy. 1 degree of change, right, in direction is a vast separation from where you might end up if you had just gotten off course a little bit. If you go, you extrapolate that out for miles and miles and miles. And so I think there's a lot of value in incremental change.
Well, I was listening to a podcast recently, and it was Christian McCaffrey, which is like the best halfback in the NFL, one of them. And he said growing up, his dad was like, do you want to make it to the league? And he said, yes. And he said, okay, you're going to have to do some things. Number one, on game days, you're going to wear jogging pants because wearing jeans, it's weighing too much on your legs throughout the day. And so if you want to be the best you can be on game day, wear jogging pants. If it's a sunny day, wear glasses. You don't need to use any extra energy squinting your eyes throughout the day because it's a sunny day. And so like it was those like little things his dad was like, because his dad played in the NFL. And he's like, if you want to be the best, there are little things that you can focus on that are ultimately going to get you closer to that every single day. It's like those things that just offload certain things. Like even setting up for the podcast today, what we've done is like we've taped out our layout of where our tripods are, where the table is, where the lights are. So now, like when we go to do another podcast, that's something we really struggled with last year, is not offloading enough to like see just this podcast go in kind of the right direction we wanted it to. So I think doing those little changes going into the new year and just building those little changes out this year is really going to help us to kind of see the incremental growth that we want. So makes a big difference.
Absolutely. And I think there is a lot to be said for when you get into the realm of, whether you want to say self-improvement or you want to say, personal growth. A lot of people poo-poo that idea because in their minds, they're like, oh, that just sounds like this kind of like fake snake oil. I mean, how much can we really change?
Yeah.
But I think when you see people who do take it seriously, like the example you were giving of the athlete, people who are really passionate about their craft do look at it like that. And there's a balance there, right? There's a balance between you work so much in your work, you work so much in your job that you never work on it.
Right.
So you're doing all the work so much that you never work on your systems. And then there's the other side that you might fall into, the ditch on the other side of the road, where you have the best systems in the world, but you never get any work done.
Yeah.
And I think it really comes down to that kind of idea of the Eisenhower matrix, which is if there is important work and there's urgent work, where do we end up? I had this conversation with a client this last week about, a lot of that work ends up being urgent because there's always fires.
Yeah.
But there comes a point where you look back and you say, that can become, not always, but it can become busy work over time. Not busy work in the sense that it doesn't do anything. It obviously does something. When we work in our work, it keeps the lights on. But then there's also the important work that's not always urgent, that helps you take the conversation from, hey, we're performing here to we're performing here.
Yeah.
And I think that's really where the idea of self-improvement, I like it, and I've joked about this before, but like wearing these black t-shirts. For me, I'm not saying this is for everybody. Some people, they express themselves through their wardrobe.
Right.
I don't do that. Like I find that it takes up way too much mental energy for me. And it just is what I like to wear. It's like my unofficial uniform. Throwing a cardigan on because, hey, I'm fashionable.
There we go.
Right. But, this is just a thing for me where it's offloading those decisions and I can focus more on my own work.
Yeah. Heck yeah. Well, let's get into it. I want to talk, we were kind of thinking about what we want to talk today about. And I just want to let's talk about expectations, kind of give people who have been listening to this podcast and people who haven't been listening to this podcast, maybe this is their first time listening, what can they expect and what is this thing that we call the archive? So we pretty much surpassed our 6 month mark. 5 or 6 months? 6 months, because is that right?
Yep.
Or was it July? So this
July.
is coming up on 6 months?
July to December is 6 months. So yeah, we're in probably
So we
month
had the full
seven-ish
month
now.
of July,
Yeah.
correct? Yeah. So we've been in here 6 months and a week, and this is our studio that we are in right now. I feel like a lot of things have changed from our day one expectations, which actually, it kind of like a lot of things changed, and then a lot of things maybe pointed back to what we originally thought. I don't know.
Yeah.
But we've been in this studio for half a year now. Let's just start. What were your expectations going in, and what are they now?
I think my expectations when we came into this was I just wanted to find clarity. Like I knew that the next right thing in front of us was getting this space that we could work out of. Beyond that, I didn't know. And so I would say that's where I have adjusted. And it's actually been a really good life lesson. A lot of times you'll hear when you're, forming up a business, hey, what's your 5-year plan?
Yeah.
Well, that's great if what you've done, if what you're doing has been done before and there's a scalable model to follow. A lot of what our intentions are with this place hasn't been done frequently enough, locally enough to where we could say, oh, this is where we want to be in 5 years. So the fact that we had these expectations of just figuring out what does the space look like off the bat, and then adjusting our expectations of what it might look like in the future, that's been really great. So I appreciate the fact that this is a place where we have worked out of for 6 months, and it's been what we needed. Now the question is what do we do from here?
Yes.
Yeah.
100% agree. I think coming into this spot, it was, and I've said this before, for me, I've always wanted a creative playground. I wanted a place where the only thing I think about when I come into this place is being creative. And for me, that's a couple of different things. The work I do day to day is creative work. It's one of the things I get paid for from people. And it's one of the things I have to have in videography. And so that has been this place in the last 6 months. Is like I come in here, I don't even have to think about being creative, which I think that will probably fizzle out over time, and I'll have to like find ways to get creative again. But like even this week, like I've been kind of at home, not doing a ton of work, trying not to. But I was like, all right, I just need a little creative spark. I'm going to come in today and like get that kind of reset I need. So the studio has been that for me. It's been the creative playground. And with that, it has been a place where I feel comfortable having people here, and not just people like I'm working for necessarily, but people I want to work with. Like I tell people that I want to work with, like, hey, I would love for you to check out this place. More so just to build a community around this place. And I think we have 100% already began building that foundation for the studio. Like I think people are buying into what this place is. We've said that over the last 6 months, but we just want to reiterate like what we are building in the studio. People like are grabbing onto, especially when they get to come into here and see the place. Now it is also our workplace, and so finding that like fine line is going to take like a lot of time, I think, of like, all right, we got to get things done, but we also want to build a community around this place. So I think that's where like I'm kind of at. The efficiency and like the workflow, like when we come into this place, I feel like is unmatched. Like even being home for the last like week with the snow, it is crazy the amount of work we get done in here, I feel like. But I'm excited to really focus in on the community aspect of this place in this new year. Like that's something I really am passionate about, and I want to bring more people in here. And with that being said, I also want to bring more people into the podcast. We've got 20 episodes under our belt. 2 of those were with guests, and the guest episodes, I think, weren't the most challenging necessarily. I don't want to say that. They were the most fulfilling, I felt like, after the fact, because we learned things we didn't know beforehand. Number 1, about the people, and number 2, just about fields that like we don't specialize in. So I'm very excited to get more people on the podcast in this new year. And that's one of the things that like I really, really want to do.
Yeah, and I think that's where, part of the conversation that, today's episode is very much like an internal meeting for us that other people are just sitting in on.
Yeah.
But, so we're getting ready to upgrade our kind of mic setup simply because these are both of the cameras that we use for audio on our cameras that we actually film with. And so we'll be moving to an actual like podcasting proper audio setup, which will be helpful when we have guests, because then we'll be able to make sure that, our guest audio sounds just as great as, ours does. And then the other part of it is our vision for the format of having guests on. So you've already got a list of like 10 people. I'm working on my list right now. We're reaching out to these folks and saying, hey, when can you come in?
Yeah.
I think that if I were to lay out an expectation that I hope we meet and that I would be proud of if we met looking back, at Christmas of, this coming year, is if we were able to have 15 guest episodes.
Okay.
That would be incredible to me. Now, I hope we have even more.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot of value that we can bring to our small audience that we have now, because it's the conversations, one, that we enjoy having, like you mentioned, that we learn from them, like you also mentioned. But I also think it really plays into that idea of we want to expose our community to the talent that is out there in our community and beyond. Because I've looked back to, my time in school here in this community, and part of the reason I didn't start out in college doing this now. It's 'cause I didn't know this job existed.
Yeah.
And it did exist in some infancy form, because when I got to college, there was a guy that was kind of doing this work with the college. And so I think a lot of what I'm realizing even as a dad is my job beyond coaching my kids as they grow up to, how to navigate life and develop as a person is to expose them to a world of possibilities. And sometimes that's hard when you live in a smaller rural area. There's nothing bad about it. It's not bad. It's just different.
Well, people in this community should feel comfortable, just as comfortable taking a step into being a photographer as they should being an electrician.
Absolutely.
And for some reason, that isn't the case, because it's not the safe bet necessarily, or it's a little bit more embarrassing to put yourself out there as the creative person in a small town compared to the business owner who's building houses.
Yeah.
Like, that makes no sense to me.
Well, to me it does, in the sense, and here's the sense for it. So a lot of times when you think about stereotypes growing up, the word creative in at least this area, because I grew up here, so I can say this from my experience, has more of a feminine association. Because think about it, when I was in school, being creative meant typically your traditional media arts, visual arts, painting, drawing, things like that. And so as you grow up, I at least saw and witnessed a lot of my friends I was growing up with who were girls. It was like, oh, they're the creative ones, But I think that as we expand the definition of what being creative is, which I would define everyone's creative. Yeah. The person who sells real estate, they're creative. They're coming up with solutions. They're designing solutions for the people that they serve, right? The welder is creative, having to figure out solutions. That's what I think that creativity ultimately is. It is the expression that we each have that is unique to us on how to solve problems and make this world better. It's almost an inspiration that lives, a spark that lives inside of all of us to make each other's lives better. But with that being said, I think a lot of times you find when all of a sudden you tell people, oh, hey, I work in the digital arts, or I work in video, or I work in communication strategy, because people don't have an understanding of what that is, because they just haven't been exposed to it, they automatically are like, and then things that people don't understand, they fear, and things that they fear, they stigmatize. I think that's part of the equation, not all of it, but part of it.
And I totally understand that. I think what I would love for this podcast to serve as on I'm going to say local scale, but really just like a kind of like a realist scale, is I hope people tune into this podcast, number one, to get a little inspiration. I think that is probably my main hope, not motivation necessarily, but I have some podcasts I tune into weekly that do provide some knowledge and some wisdom on areas that I am also passionate about. But more than anything, I get done listening to those certain podcasts and I just feel a little bit more inspired. And so I hope, number one, when people listen to this podcast, especially with some of the guests we bring in, and they hear the stories of people's upbringing, the stories of people's careers, how they got started, and especially kind of focusing in on probably primarily on people who are in the same type of industry we are. I hope they feel inspired, the people that are listening. But number two, I hope people do feel a little bit of, or gain a little bit of knowledge after listening to this, and hopefully we can provide that. Those are probably my main two things going into the new year of what to expect from my perspective on this podcast is number one, I hope you feel inspired after you're listening to this. And then number two, I hope you gain some knowledge of how do I actually become a graphic designer? How do I actually become a photographer? How do I actually become a communication strategist? Those are the things I hope people acquire after they listen to this.
And I think we can deliver on that.
Yeah.
I think our goals and our systems are in line with each other because, number one, we're taking steps towards actually building out the function of the microphone setup that we talked about, which it might sound kind of silly to mention that again, but I think for us, like we're thinking through if we want these people to come on, like what's the actual function of making it easy enough to where it doesn't become a barrier
Yes.
for us mentally. But then also the part of just like making those initial contacts. So I know I'm already working on getting someone scheduled for the end of this month, beginning of next month. You're doing the same thing. And so I'm like, yeah, this isn't going to be one of those things that we look back on in December and we're like, oh yeah, we're kind of embarrassed of that first
Right.
episode in January because we said it and we didn't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the microphone thing, it's like one of those things. It's like if you're in audio and video, like whenever you have someone in here and you're focusing on a podcast, like the actual conversation of the podcast, but then you're adding on top of that, like trying to figure out the little things like, oh, that person's audio sucks because we don't have the capabilities of having a 4-person podcast. So like we're just offloading that.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah, it's
put
so
the
true.
expense on the table.
Yep.
Let's get it out there. Now when people come in here, that's not even something in our mind thinking about the audio because we've already got it figured out. And now we can actually focus on the conversation. That's where I feel like we went wrong. Not wrong necessarily, but that's where like our struggles were on having the guests on already in the first 20
Yeah.
is like they would get in here and then we're focusing on all the wrong things.
Yeah, because it's the technical aspect, and this would be, I would say, as like a random takeaway I'll throw into the pod. I've mentioned this before. The only time I ever think about spending money on gear is when I'm doing something already, not aspirational, it's not something I want to do.
Right.
When I'm doing something already and I'm limited, my gear or lack thereof is getting in the way.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, because then I don't think about it. It's just like, okay, purchase, move on.
Right. And
It's-
now we can focus on the actual conversation that we're having.
Absolutely.
Do you want to like give a little bit of just what people can expect from the guests that you kind of have lined up?
Yes. Okay. So I'm excited. I'm going to be bringing in, I think probably more along the lines of business folks who just have a lot of knowledge that they can drop. And we're just going to talk to them about their experience of how they got into their career, have been in it for multiple decades, and have learned those like old school lessons that are actually very applicable right now because those things never go out of fashion. So that's one of the things I'm bringing to the table is people who I've worked with for years that I'm like really proud to introduce our audience to.
Yeah.
That's the only teaser I'll give until I get them officially signed
Yep.
and booked in.
And mine's probably 50-50. I've got 50% of the people that I know like the back of my hand, and I love those people and I want other people to hear what they have to say. The other 50% are actually like, and I'm an extrovert, but man, like the podcast format is for some reason like a little scary, like asking someone to have a conversation. Like that is a pretty intimidating ask for somebody's like, hey, you want to come talk for an hour? We don't even know each other, but we kind of know each other through the social media world. So mine's 50% of like people like I've known for years and years, and I admire what they have to say, and I hope other people will as well. And then the other 50% are people that I really are gravitating towards over the last couple years on social media, and I want to pick their brain, get to know them more. But most of my people are probably going to fall in the realm of media creators, and especially people that I really find inspiration from in the social media world, and some talented people that I've got on deck. And I'm excited. I hope they all say yes, and I hope that we can all make it work. And man, I'm pumped. I got about 10 to 15 people on my list right now that I'm going to be reaching out to. So
Yeah. And I'm excited selfishly for us because I think anytime that I get the opportunity to talk to someone I don't know, especially already,
Yeah.
it's like, let me pepper you with 20
Yeah.
questions, because I think being curious is one of the most underrated things
Yeah.
that a person can be, because you think about all the world and all the information,
Yeah.
and all the experiences. And so then to act like we know everything is just such a sad thing.
Well, and two, like this podcast is kind of like a representation of that intimidating factor when it comes to asking someone, because me and you did not know each other
No.
2.5 years ago,
No.
3 years ago. Like, I think that is one of the coolest things about this podcast is like we did not know each other, and now we find so many commonalities in the same world. Like, there's
Yep.
so many parallels, but there's also so many differences. And what I've realized, like sitting down and talking through basically 45-minute conversations with you over the span of the last 6 months is like we share a lot in common, but we also share a lot of differences.
Absolutely.
And I've learned so much just like sitting at the table and sharing those things. And so that's kind of what to expect, I think, from the Archive podcasts in 2025 are a lot of guests, but then also just a lot of the things we're learning about life, about business, about being a dad. And then also I want to get some fitness people in here too.
All right, man.
Yeah. So I got a few in mind for the fitness world, but
I'm excited.
Yeah.
I love learning, and the opportunity that we might have to learn from some of these incredible people is just, it's exciting. And if I think about like what a gift it would be to introduce some of these folks that mean a lot to us to the people who listen in and are part of the Archive podcast audience. So, man, I'm excited for the year ahead. Anything else you want to add on before we wrap
I
up?
think if you're one of those people that's a little bit curious, maybe this is your first time listening to the Archive podcast and you're wondering, all right, what is this thing? Follow us on some social media accounts, the Archive KY on Instagram and Facebook. That's where we will hopefully be posting a lot more behind the scenes of what this studio is to us and kind of where we see it going forward in the future. I think we're going to be sharing a lot of those things on Instagram and Facebook. And we're really kind of starting from the ground up, like the last 6 months have been this experimental thing. And we've kind of zoned in on the amount of energy we want to put into it and the direction we want it to go. And I'm very excited to see it go in those places in 2025. So
it's going to be fun. I'm ready for it. And until next week, see you guys.
Peace.